What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another Swift video. In today's video, we're going to be building out a pretty simple COVID tracker. I've been wanting to build out a whole app on this channel again. Shorter videos have been kind of the most recent thing. So here's the app we're going to be building out. We're going to bring in this pretty sweet looking graph up here. We'll talk about formatting data, the dates, the numbers. We'll also add in an ability to filter out the cases by state. Luckily, cases are going down here in the US. We'll talk about, of course, getting the data from an API and basically everything in between. So fairly bare bones, but we'll set everything up in a pretty decent architecture. So you'll get a good glimpse of, how to build out an app. So if that all sounds good, make sure you start by destroying the like button down below for the YouTube algorithm. Helps push the video out, and hit the like button if you're just into iOS. And if you're into iOS and want to stick around, hit subscribe while you're at it to be notified for new updates and to keep the channel going and growing together. That all said, let's get into the video. Let's go ahead and get started by opening up Xcode and creating a brand new project here. We're going to go ahead and stick with the app template under iOS, and let's go ahead and give this project a name of COVID Tracker. You want to make sure your language is set to Swift, your lifecycle UIKit, and your interface is storyboard. We'll be doing your UI programmatically, but no Swift UI today. Go ahead and create the project and save it wherever you'd like. I'll toss it onto my desktop here. And first things first, we're going to go ahead and collapse this right panel. I'll jump into my view controller file here. I'll bump up that font size, and maybe we'll go ahead and also select a simulator and just give it a run here so we can actually build and start seeing something hopefully show up in our simulator here. And while it's doing that, let me expand our Xcode window here, and we'll dive into basically what we want to do. Now, before we start writing, the steps that we want to take to build out the app, I want to bring your attention to the API over here that I've got opened up in a browser. If you head on over to this website, covidtracking.com/data API version -2, it's a pretty great historical data API for COVID cases, specifically in the US. So they give you national values, single day values, and then you can also filter down by state. I apologize if you aren't from the US, but this is the easiest API that I found. You don't need to sign up, you don't need an API key, it's just kind of free to use. So basically, like you guys saw, what I want this app to do is when you boot it up, it'd be nice to see, values of like the federal level, so the entire states, and then maybe a filter option to filter out those values by state. And maybe if we have time, we'll go into filtering out on a daily basis. So that said, what do we first want to do? So this first controller here, this is going to be basically our data of COVID cases, and we're basically going to show cases based on the scope that we're looking at. So when we launch the app, it should be at a national level, and then we can filter down on a state-by-state level. So that all said, let's go ahead and start building this out. So first things first, let's add a title here, and we're going to go ahead and say this is going to be maybe by default US national COVID cases. Or maybe this might be a little long, so let's just go ahead and actually call it COVID cases, and maybe we'll have a subtitle which is going to show the scope of what we're looking at, which in this case would be national. So before we go ahead and hard code that title, let's talk about, in a nutshell, the pieces that we're going to want. So I'm just going to comment it here. So first and foremost, we're going to want a way to call APIs, or the API endpoints, I should say. And we're going to want a way to have view models to configure our view. We're going to need to have a view, and I'm thinking we're going to stick with the table view, and based on how we do on time, we'll bring in like a nice chart to plot the data. And let's see, after we've gone ahead and brought that stuff in, we're going to also want to have a way to filter and then /fetch, or rather let the user pick the state that they want. And then we'll want to update our main UI. So it sounds like we're going to want two main controllers. The first one here is going to be our COVID controller, or our COVID, call it whatever the heck you want. And then I'm going to create another view controller here, and this is going to be maybe a state selection controller. So we're going to create a UI view controller here, subclass, so UI view controller. And this is going to be a, maybe let's call it a filter view controller to make it a little more extensible if we so choose to. So let's go ahead and create this, save it, and in here we're basically going to allow the user to pick a state. So we're going to go and give it a title of select a state. So that's looking pretty good. Let me just drag this up. And yeah, so we want the view controller to start off here embedded inside a navigation controller. So we have, the navigation bar and all those semantics. So we can do that programmatically, but we're gonna cut a corner here for the sake of time. And I'm gonna go in the storyboard and just select this controller here. In the toolbar, we'll go ahead and hit editor, and we're gonna hit embed in a navigation controller, which does this for us. And then we'll select the navigation bar on that left-hand controller there. Open up the attributes inspector, and we're going to go ahead and check that second box here for prefers a large title. Go ahead and run your app, and now you'll have your title showing up here as you would expect. Next up, we want to create the object that's going to handle our API calls. So we're going to be super creative and call it a API caller. I'm going to go ahead and say API caller.swift. And basically, it's just going to be a singleton class that we leverage. So we'll say there's a shared instance of this API caller. We're going to privatize the initializer here. And if you think about, what do we actually want to get back from the API caller? In other words, what functions do we want on it? We're going to want basically to get COVID data. And of course, this is going to have some sort of scope and completion handler. We're going to also want to get a list of states. So we're going to say get state list with also a completion handler. And I'm just going to be a little lazy and stick the models down here in the API caller so we can use them directly. So we're going to say models, and we're going to want a state model. And a state model, we want to keep it pretty simple. It's going to be something codable. We'll go ahead and do that. We'll get that from the API, and then we're going to want a bunch of models for our actual data as well. So let's go ahead and also think about how do we filter down this COVID data, right? We want to get it for either nationally or a particular state. So I'm going to go ahead and put a scope on here. Maybe we can call it data scope, which is going to be an enum. And the two types that I just mentioned is we can get national data, or we can get state data for a particular state object. And now what we'll go ahead and do here is we're going to say get COVID data for a scope, and this is going to be a data scope. And of course, there's going to be a completion handler on here, which will be an escaping block, which is going to give us a result back. Let me close this right panel to give ourselves a little more room, and we'll go ahead and line break all this goodness. And our result is going to give back, some type of model. I'm just going to call it a string for now so we can actually just write it out. So something is, here and working. And this block is going to return void. Now, similarly, our get state list function here is not going to take in a scope, but it is going to similarly take in a completion handler. And the completion handler, once again, will be escaping. It's going to return a result. In the success case, we're going to have an array of states. If something goes wrong, we're going to have an error, hopefully. And this whole thing returns void, not voity. So let's go ahead and fix that. All right. So now the next thing we want to do, which is everyone's favorite part, let's go ahead and take a look at our API responses and figure out, what the URLs are and what the response JSON looks like. So let's start by looking at the list of states, since I think it's the simplest API call here. Here is the URL, so I'm just going to right click and copy it. And maybe I'll go ahead and create a constants struct inside of here. We'll go ahead and just drop in the URLs in there so we can just reference them more easily. So we'll say constants, and this is going to be static let all states URL will be a URL with this string, and we'll just go ahead and paste that in. Notice you don't need an API key, which is kind of nice. And let's see what the response of this guy looks like. So let's go ahead and simply click on it, and we get a whole lot of JSON. So we can exclude in our codable model the stuff we don't really care about. So I don't care about the links. I don't care about the meta key here. I do care about data, which looks to be an array of these state objects is what I'll go ahead and call them. So There's a bunch of things in here like census and this and that. However, I don't really care about the majority of this. All I really care about is the name of the state and probably the state code, which is what we'll use to go ahead and get data for the state code. So let's go ahead and just bring that in here. So we have a root key of data, name and state code. So we'll go ahead inside a state. We're going to say there's a name and there's a state code, which is also a string. And similarly, we're going to go ahead and say there's a struct of a state list response, which is codable, which will have data, which is a array of state objects, just like that. And that's actually sufficient to write out this API call. So let's go ahead and write this out and actually hook it up to our UI. You might be wondering why I'm starting with this particular API call. It's kind of simple and straightforward, so I figured it's probably easy to start with it. So let's go ahead and write this out. So first and foremost, we want to grab the URL. So we're going to say guardlet URL is our constants. And grabbing our URL, we do need to unwrap it since the initializer is failable. Next up, we're going to create a URL session task. Shared, we're going to do data task with a URL and a completion handler. Passing in that URL, the completion block gives us data back, a response, and a optional error. We're going to validate that we do in fact have some data, and we're going to validate that we don't in fact have an error. Otherwise, something has gone wrong. We probably should return error there in the completion, but I'll be lazy and skip it for a minute. And next up, we want to convert the response data here to our model. So we'll go ahead and say our result is JSON decoder, rather try to use JSON decoder to decode this state list response dot self from said data. And once we've gone ahead and done that, we can get the states out by saying result.data, I guess, here. And finally, we can pass it into the success case in our completion handler, just like that. And in the catch here, we want to catch any errors that occur, so we can pass back that to the caller as well. And we should probably make an attempt to spell things correctly since it's kind of important. So there's that. And then finally, we'll go ahead and kick off this task to go ahead and fetch. So now that we've got this API written, let's make sure it actually works. So we created that state, filter controller. So I'm going to go ahead and create a bar button at the top right of our app here when we first start it up, and that's going to allow us to filter. So let's go ahead and create a function here, create filter button, and we're going to create that function right down here, create filter button, and basically we want to hang on to the scope that this controller is rendering for. So by default, the scope is going to be the national scope. So we're going to say API caller data scope, and this is going to be national by default. And here what we can go ahead and do is we want to create a bar button item. So we're going to say navigation item dot write bar button item. And what we're going to do is we're going to show a title which correlates to whatever scope we're kind of looking at that point in time. But before I do that, let's go ahead and fill these out. So style done, target self, and this is going to be did tap filter. All right, and let's go ahead and create this function as well, which is going to be a Objective-C selector, just like that. And basically for the title here, what I'm going to go ahead and do is we're going to resolve a title up above. So we'll go ahead and say let title, or maybe I should say, I don't know, button title, so we don't conflict with the view controller's title property, is going to be a string. And essentially I'm going to go ahead and switch on the current scope. And we are going to say if it's national, we're going to go ahead and say, go ahead and return national. And otherwise, if it is a state, we have the state model here. We can return state.name, which is a part of our model here. And that's basically how that button's going to look. And when we tap on the button, what do we want to do? We want to create the filter view controller. We also want to go ahead and wrap it inside of a navigation controller. So we have, a navigation bar. So we'll go ahead and make it the root right there. And then finally, we want to go ahead and present this controller with a animation and no completion parameter here. So go ahead and give it a run, and let's see if we can see that other controller. We can in fact see it. It's looking a little weird because we didn't set a background color to it. So let's go ahead and work on that filter view controller, which I put right here. So let's go ahead and first set a background color so it doesn't look so strange. We'll say system background. Now what else do we want here? We want a completion handler. So we're going to say public var completion, and this is basically going to pass back to the caller, which state was selected. So it's going to be optional. So let's go ahead and do that. And we'll call it once the user taps on one of the states in the table view that we're about to create. So we'll create this table view here. And this is basically going to be responsible for showing our list of states. So we'll go ahead and create a table view. And we're going to say frame is 0, style is grouped. Go ahead and return that table at the bottom of that closure. And of course, don't forget to register a cell here. We're not going to use a custom cell. We're going to keep it simple for the sake of time here. But once we've gone ahead and created that, go ahead and add your table as a subview. You want to assign its data source as well as assign its delegate. And respectively, you want to conform to those interfaces, those protocols. So we'll conform to them up here. So let's go ahead and spell that correctly. Otherwise, it's not going to be able to find it. And let's go ahead and further implement. So we need to override view did layout subviews. Go ahead and call the super function for it. And we'll give our table view here a frame to match the entire bounds of this controller. And then we want to have a bunch of table view functions here. So we'll go ahead and say number of rows. We're going to return something. We'll just do 0 for a quick second. Cell for row at index path. We'll need to dequeue a cell in here. And I realize I'm going a little quickly. I'll talk through kind of what I did once we kind of get to a decent stopping point in this controller. But basically, we'll go ahead and dequeue a cell here. We're going to return it like that. We're going to assign its text label to something. In our case, it'll actually be the state's name. And then once the user selects a particular row, we want to deselect it. We want to get the state, and then we want to call the completion handler. So we'll say call completion and basically dismiss as well. So now that we've got all this set up, we first need to fetch a list of states here. And the way we're going to do that is at the bottom of view.load, we'll go ahead and say fetch states. And this function is going to basically do what the name implies it's going to do. It's going to fetch our states from our API caller. So we'll say shared. And we're going to say go ahead and get a list of states. And this is going to give us a result back. Now what we want to do is we want to switch on said results, and in successes case, we're going to get a collection of states. And in the failure case, we'll get an error, which for now, we're just going to print it. Of course, in your actual app, please, please, please manage the error correctly. We're going to assign the states to a global states property, which we're going to create momentarily as soon as I capture weak self here so we don't cause a memory leak. And let's see, let's go ahead and create that. We'll say private var states is going to be an array of states. And essentially, once the actual state has been set, we're going to say table view, go ahead and reload yourself. So this looks good to me. Now, in our number of rows, we are going to say states.count for the number of rows. For the cell for row, we're going to get the nth state in our array. So we'll say states, and we want to get indexPath.row. And here we're going to say state.name. And let's see, what else do we need to do? So now here we want to get, once we select a state, we want to get the nth state that was selected, similar to what we did in cell for row. And we want to call the completion handler passing in the state. And finally, we want to call dismiss with a animation and nil for completion here. The other thing you might want to do is add a cancel button in case the user, doesn't want to change their scope. So we can actually do that at the top here. Maybe we'll add like a little X button. We'll say navigation item dot left bar button item. And this is going to be a UI bar button item with a style of close and maybe a target of self, an action, and this should be a selector did tap on close. And let's go ahead and just create this selector. I'm just putting it wherever basically, but try to organize your code. But in here, we'll go ahead and say true and nil. So let's go ahead and run this. I know we just typed out a lot of code, and let's make sure that we can actually see a list of states. So I go ahead and tap on this, and it looks like I don't see our list of states. So what the heck is going on? It looks like we're actually calling something from the main thread, or from the background thread that should be on the main thread. And I suspect it is our table view reload, which actually Xcode is telling us is what we screwed up. Of course, keep in mind, anything that is UI related, do it on the main thread. And anything, networking should most likely be on the background thread. So once we go ahead and do that, we can see that we do in fact get a list of states. We can actually go ahead and close this out as well. And right now when we tap on it, we dismiss it, but we're not actually passing back the state to the caller because we never actually assigned the completion handler in the presenter side. So if we go back to the presenter, we can say vc.completion is basically going to give us a state back. We're going to want to capture weak self. And what I'll go ahead and do here is we want to say self.scope is going to be a state with the selected state. Pretty simple. And I'll also go ahead and we want to say fetch data now. So we're going to say dispatch queue. We could actually just do this in the background thread now that I think about it. Now we don't have a fetch data call to actually, go ahead and fetch our data, but we will go ahead and say private func fetch data. And this is going to fetch our data for our current scope. So what do we need to do? We want to call self.fetchData. And we're also going to go ahead and say create that filtered button because since the scope is different now, the title for it will go ahead and change. So now that we've got this here, we want to actually write out the API call before we call it from there to fetch our COVID data. So now in here, we want to most likely do the exact same thing. So I'll actually go ahead and copy and paste this, but our URL is going to differ. So let's go back to our browser and let's go ahead and take a look at what the data URL is going to look like. So if we have the state picked, we want to get a single state's, so this is a single state's metadata, but we want to get historical data for a state is what I'm looking for. And basically this is the URL here. So we can go ahead and actually copy this and I'm going to stick it into our constants here. So we'll go ahead and say COVID state data URL. And actually I'm just going to make this a string because we'll need to tack on the state that we care about. So you can see here that this passes in the state's code. So we'll go ahead and pass in, whatever state's code. And actually, it doesn't really even make sense to make this a constant. So what I'll actually go ahead and do is when we call this fetch here, we're going to need to create the URL. So I'm going to say URL string is going to be a string, and we're going to switch on the scope. And if the scope is national, we want to do something. We're going to return, some URL string. And if the scope is the state, we have a state model. And we'll go ahead and return this, but inside of the actual string, we're going to go ahead and stick in, we're going to interpolate the state dot, the state code, and we're going to go ahead and lowercase that. And let's see why this is yelling at me, because I forgot to actually assign this. So instead of returning it, we're going to say this is a URL string, and similar, this is the URL string. All right, so that is the URL for the state by state. Let's take a look at the URL for the national level. So that would be up here, and we don't need to compute anything in here because there's basically just one URL. So what you could do is go ahead and just stick that in right there. And this is all under the assumption that the JSON response is somewhat similar. So now that we've gone ahead and done this, you can actually construct a URL from this URL string. So this is going to be URL string, and we're going to call the API respectively like that. Now, what we want to actually do is figure out what the codable model looks like. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this national data response, and it is beyond enormous, so this is kind of hard to actually even read. So let me actually try clicking the state response. Hopefully that's a little less crazy. And of course, this one's not that easy to read either. It looks like it's trying there, but it's not working out too well. So let's see. It looks like we have a meta, and I would hope we have a data in here as well. Now, when this stuff is kind of hard to read like this, the best bet that you have is to try to deserialize a JSON directly here and read it in your console. So let me try to do that actually. I'm gonna go ahead and say, try to use JSON serialization and create a JSON object with the data, and we are going to allow fragments, and then I'm just going to go ahead and print out the results in hopes to actually figure out what that structure looks like, because it's a little crazy in the browser. So let's go to the view controller, and we're going to say API caller shared, and we're going to say go ahead and get COVID data for the current scope, and here is our completion. Now in our actual block here, what we want to go ahead and do is switch on the results. In the success, we should have some sort of data back. And in the failure, we're going to have an error back that we're going to go ahead and be lazy and simply print out for now. And of course, we want to call fetch data as soon as the app also opens, because it's going to be set to national by default. So let's go ahead and look at that response getting dumped out right there. Looks like it's an enormous response, not surprised. So I'm going to go all the way up here and take a look at what this looks like. So we do get a data key here, which looks to be pointing to an array, and it has each of these blocks inside of it. So let's see what each of these has. So I'm going to go ahead and come back to the API caller and go down to the models, and we're going to start creating some models here. So we're going to go ahead and say we have a COVID data response, which is going to be codable. It has a data, and this is going to be, let's see how this data is structured. So every data looks to have a cases key in it, which points to some cases data. It has a date in it. It has an outcome in it, which is kind of depressing. I think it shows you who died. It shows you states. It shows you some testing data. So let's actually figure out what we want to show in our UI. So I think cases is probably the most, common thing you would want to show. So there's total, there's value. I guess what we want is value for the cases. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to call this COVID day data, since it represents a single day. We'll go ahead and create this here as codable, and each of these days has a cases key, which points to another dictionary. And in here, what I care about is the key for total, which points to value. So let's see if I do this correctly. So this is going to be COVID cases, which will be another model down here, COVID cases, codable. And in here we have value. And let's see, so cases, so we have total. Let's make sure I do this right. So this actually has total in it. So cases is pointing here, which has total, and then total is another dictionary that has a value key in it, which is an integer. So I'm going to go ahead and call this total cases, like so, which is once again codable. And finally, it has a value, which is a integer. So hopefully all my errors go away and we can now decode to this. So let's try doing that. So instead of, whoops, wrong one. Instead of doing this whole dumping nonsense, we're going to use the decoder to try to decode our appropriate response from the data. Now from this, what I want to go ahead and do is, actually, now that I think about it, let me open that up again. What the other thing that we want in here actually is the date. So we have date represented as a string because it'd be silly to not show the date, and that's at the same level at cases. So if I come down here, I'm gonna also go ahead and let's see if I can find it. I'm gonna go ahead and say date, which is going to be a string, and we probably want to pass back a better model, right? So these are our codable models, but what I probably want to go ahead and pass back is a struct that is something like this. So we're gonna say COVID day data, and let's make sure I didn't already use this. Looks like I did. Let's go ahead and call this something else. We'll call it day data, and we want basically a date in it, and we want a count in it, I guess, because we don't want the caller to have to go ahead and like traverse all this codable data, because that would kind of be a pain in the butt to do. So let's go ahead and see if this works. So we've got this hooked up already. Now result is going to have data, which has quite a few things on it. It's actually an array. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is we will print out the count of this, and I'm also going to change the signature of the function up here. And in the success case, we're going to return an array of day data. So let's go ahead and give this a run, and let's make sure we are in fact getting something printed out that is valid. So it looks like we're getting a coding error here. So let's see, no value associated with coding key for name, and that's an int value. Let's see why that is. What did I screw up? So we have data, we have COVID day data, we have total, and then we have value. I don't see name in here. Let's make sure we're using the proper object. So we're saying, it looks like we're saying state list response here, which is not what we want. We want the COVID data response model, since that's the new one we created. And it still looks like we're getting an error here saying JSON key index 419. And let's see, string value cases, int value is nil. So it looks like in some cases, this cases is optional, or it's not what we expect it to be. So we can go ahead and make that optional. Let's see if that resolves it. All right, looks like we still have an error. So let's see what's going on. Index 419, coding key cases for an int value. Expected int value, but found null instead. So let's see, for our value, I think is what it's actually complaining about. So let's try making that optional. So this whole thing is a little bit of a guess and check. You know, when you're working on a larger app, you'll see, something appropriate, but now we get our count back, which implies that the decoding was successful. So cool, so now that we've got this going on, the next thing we want to do is convert our actual response into the models we want to return to the caller. So one thing that we do want to go ahead and do is convert our date objects. So our date objects are actually returned as strings if we look at, any of, let's see if I can find an example here. If we look at the date objects in our actual response, we know we want to convert that to actual date objects. So what I'll go ahead and actually do is we're going to say for each of these, we're going to have a model in, and each of these models basically has a date. So let's go ahead and just print these out. What I want to do is figure out what the format of that string date is, so I can create a date formatter that looks like it. So it looks like we have the year, the month, and then the day right there. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is up here, we're going to create an extension. And this extension is going to be on date formatter. We're going to create a formatter. So we'll say our data formatter, or maybe we'll go ahead and call it day formatter, is going to be a particular type of formatter. And this is basically going to allow us to convert the string that we get back into a date object. So we'll say date formatter is what we want to create. We're going to want to return it here. And let's actually go ahead and just call this formatter so it doesn't give us the redundant naming. Now in here, the most important part, we're going to say the date format is basically going to be this, and this is going to be year, this is going to be month, and this is going to be day. You can also alternatively, not alternatively, but in addition, I guess, you can also assign the time zone as well as the date locale, which I'll just use current. And essentially now what you can go ahead and do in this API call is you can actually compact map this stuff. So we'll go ahead and compact map. And I'm going to go ahead and say this is models, and this is going to be a day data. And we are going to convert, so we'll say date formatter dot formatter this one right here, day formatter, and we want to create a date from a particular string, and that string is going to be $0.date, and we'll also go ahead and get a count here, which will be $0.cases. And the one thing that is tricky here is that this returns an optional. So I'll go ahead and say guard let date is going to be this, otherwise return nil. And this is going to be date here, and we'll toss a return right there. So what we're essentially doing is we're taking our codable models and we're compact mapping them to the models that we want to pass back in our completion handler. And these are going to be day data models like that. And if you make the explicit type there, your error will go away because the compiler sometimes is just not smart enough to pick up on what you're trying to do. And then finally, my long spiel comes to an end. We go ahead and pass back the models to the caller. And the way that we'll make sure that this is in fact working, well, let's make sure this is correct first. So cases, we want from that the cases.total.value. And actually this is also optional. So what we'll also go ahead and do is we'll say let value is this, and we're going to pass in the value here just like that. And let's make sure those errors go away. And now in our view controller, we should be getting day data. So we'll go ahead and simply print out daydata.count to make sure we're getting it back. We're almost done. Stick with me. All right, so we're definitely getting the print statement still, which means we're looking good. So let's go ahead and assign this to a global instance of day data, which will be here. We'll go ahead and say private var day data is going to be day data, and it'll be empty by default. And once again, similarly, whenever we set to this on the main thread, we're going to update the UI. Now, I mentioned adding in a chart, but we're also first going to bring in a table view. We'll see how we do on time to bring in that chart. But we're going to say private let table view. And this table view is going to be nothing more than a standard UI table view. And we'll go ahead and say this is a table view like that. We'll go ahead and bring in a frame of 0. I'm going to go ahead and return the table. Going to register a pretty vanilla looking cell to it, just like that. And let's see, what else do we want to do here? We're going to go ahead and say reload data. I'm going to go ahead and say configure table, which we probably want to do before we make the API call. And let's go ahead and bring in this configure function here, which is going to do a few things. First and foremost, it's going to add the table as a sub view. We actually don't care about the delegate. We just want to show data. So we're just going to assign the data source. And we want to go ahead and conform. So we'll go ahead and say table view data source. And then down here, I'm just going to go ahead and put it down here, the table view stuff. Go ahead and say table, and we're going to say number of rows is going to be our daydata.count. Our self row at index, we're going to go ahead and get our data, which essentially is going to be from our day data, the nth element. And we'll also go ahead and dequeue a cell here. So we'll say this is a UI table view cell. And it's going to be table view dequeue a reusable cell with a identifier for the given index path. Go ahead and return the cell. And the text is a little interesting. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is we're going to go ahead and say create text with data. And I'm actually going to do this in a different function for the sake of just like cleanliness. This function is basically going to create, as the name implies, the string that needs to go into the particular cell, like so. And the reason I did this here is because we're going to now need to convert the dates to an appropriate string as well. So we can go ahead and come back to our API caller. And I'm going to add another formatter up here, which we can create this as like a pretty formatter. And instead of, using this format, we can say formatter dot date style is going to be medium, and that's just going to print out things to look a lot nicer. And if we come back to our controller here, we can go ahead and first get the string, or the date string, I should say. And this is going to be our date formatter dot our pretty formatter. And we're going to go ahead and create a string. So let's see why this is yelling at me. So this should be let's go ahead and hit Command B in case Xcode is being dumb. Let's see what I screwed up here. Something is not correct. There it is, pretty formatter. We want to get a string from a particular date, which is going to be our data.date. And finally, we're going to go ahead and return a string, which is our date string, followed by a colon, followed by data.count. Now we're going to format the count here in a quick moment as well, but just to get this whole thing working here, let's go ahead and actually finish this up and run it. So we want to capture weak self here, just like that. And I think we should be good to go. So this should be self.tableView. Let's go ahead and give this a run. This video has gotten way longer than I wanted it to, but let's see what the heck happened. Where is our table? I think I forgot to assign a frame, which, yep, I did. So we need to go ahead and override view did layout subviews, and we'll go ahead and give the table view a frame to match the entire bounds of our view. So go ahead and give that a run, and there is our data. So March 7th, 2021, that's when they actually stopped collecting data at this API. This is the number of cases, which is slightly frightening. It's 28 million, which is a little nuts. So the next thing I want to do here is I want to format this number to look a lot nicer, because it's a little ugly right now. There's no commas. So what we could actually introduce here is a number formatter. So I'm going to go ahead and create it up here. And actually, yeah, we can leave it as internal instead of private. We'll go ahead and call this a number formatter, which the name kind of gives away its job. So we're going to go ahead and do that. And we'll go ahead and say a formatter is a number formatter. Go ahead and say formatter. And I think there is a format style or something like that on here. I know you can also supply the locale. Let's see what I'm looking for. Number style. And number style, you can do, things like currency, which is not what we want, decimal, ordinal, percent. Let's see if we actually can get away without assigning this, because I think it'll add the commas for us. And we're going to go ahead and say the total here is going to be self.number formatter, and we want to go ahead and get a string from a particular NS number, and this is going to be created from our data, which is going to be data.count, just like that. And now we're going to go ahead and drop in the count there, and hopefully things are comma separated. Now this total gives us a optional. It looks like it actually didn't bring in the commas. So let's go ahead and first of all coalesce this to data.count. And let's come up here and actually add a, I think it's a separator or something like that, grouping separator. So let's see what this is. Grouping separator, the string used by the receiver for a grouping separator. Interesting. So there's currency, always show decimal. So we want the separator to be a comma. Let's see if I need to assign the number style here as well. We, I guess, could use currency. It's gonna add at that point a $sign, which is not what I want. So let's see what else is in here. There's decimal, none, ordinal, scientific, spell out. So scientific style format. Let's see what spell out is. A style in which the numbers are spelt out in the language. That's not what I want. Let's try scientific and see what that looks like. Apple's description is kind of not good. Looks like we have a error here because this gives us an integer. So we'll go ahead and say this is a string instead, and that should hopefully appease the compiler. And we still don't have commas. Interesting. So let's see. I gotta remember how we actually use this formatter. So we're gonna go into this formatter and I'm gonna see what is available to us. Bear with me. So we can get a context, we can get a string. There is a default formatter behavior. I think that is what we want. So let's go ahead and see if we can use that. So we can say default formatter behavior, which returns a number formatter behavior. So I think we might want to assign the behavior on here instead. So let's see what formatter behaviors there are. So there's default. Let's see what that gives us. And if this takes too long, then I'm not going to waste too much time on it. It looks like it is taking too long. So let's go ahead and give it one more try. Otherwise, I'm going to forget it because I don't want to kill too much time on this. So there's grouping separator, uses grouping separator. I guess this determines whether the receiver displays the group separator. Maybe this should be true. And we're going to say formatter. That's not how you spell formatter. Formatter. And we're going to go ahead and say the separator is going to be a comma, which it should pick up from the locale. But, I digress. All right, I'm going to probably figure this out after I end the video, but whatever. We'll forget that number formatter. But this is basically where we're at. Let's go ahead and try to filter this. So if I come here, some of you might know I'm actually in New Jersey. So let's go ahead and look for New Jersey here. So we'll go ahead and hit this. And it looks like we didn't actually we did. We updated the data. It was quite quick, so it's hard to tell. But, 812,000 cases on March 7th. Boy, that's a lot. Now, the other thing I had opened here, and I don't know if I want to get into this now since this video is kind of long, is this charts framework to render out different kinds of charts. Because it'd be pretty cool if we showed a chart. Let's see if we can get away with integrating this fairly quickly. So I'm going to copy the GitHub URL there. We'll come to Xcode, go to File. I'm going to go to Swift Packages, and we're going to add package dependency. We're going to go ahead and paste that in. It's going to resolve charts. Just keep hitting next, 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 and essentially it's going to go ahead and bring in the dependency. There is a couple things for example code in here, but we could use, like bar charts maybe, or line charts, really subjective. But bear with it while it brings in the framework. Should be fairly quickly, and hopefully everything should still be compiling. And what I planned on doing was adding a table header view. So instead of just seeing this raw data, having like a table header that plots out a graph, because that'd be pretty cool. So that all said, let's see what we need to do. So here we're reloading the data. I'm going to go ahead and here also say self dot create table, or we can say self dot create graph. And this create graph is going to basically, create a graph for us. So my computer is getting super loud with its fan, which means that it's compiling, which is good. And I'm also going to come up here and import charts, which it's still compiling, it looks like. So bear with it. Looks like we have an error in the compile. So let's see, no such module charts because, let's see why. So we're going to see where charts is. It's not actually popping up. Interesting. So let's see what's going on. So we definitely have charts brought in, which I guess I can close up Xcode and let's see if we reopen it, if it resolves. Otherwise, I'll bring it in via CocoaPods. This video has gotten way longer than what I wanted it to be, but that's okay. Hopefully we get our nice chart coming in, which will make everything look a whole lot nicer. So let's go ahead and bring this in. I'll go ahead and bring in charts, not carts, charts. And let's see, so it looks like it's not resolving. So the other thing that I guess we can go ahead and do if we come back to this, it does tell you how to bring it in via CocoaPods. So let's see, CocoaPods installation, it is just called charts. So what I'll go ahead and do is close Xcode. We're going to go ahead and open up terminal. We're going to cd into the project and do a pod init. The reason it's not working with SPM, Swift Package Manager, is always, a question. You could go ahead and debug it, but generally it's kind of irrelevant how you bring in the dependency. So long as, you bring it in and it works is good enough for me. So I'll go ahead and bring that in, lowercase that p, and I'm going to go ahead and run pod install. We'll see what happens with the duplicate dependency because we did already bring it in with SPM, but hopefully it won't conflict. After you've gone ahead and ran it to install, go ahead and open up your XC workspace that should have been created for you. And let's go ahead and try to run this again in our 12 Pro Max. The first time you give this a run after bringing in the dependency, it is going to take longer to compile by virtue of, just being a bigger project and having more source. So bear with it here. Jump back to our view controller. Hopefully our error goes away and it's able to resolve charts. Otherwise, this is going to be a part 2. So it looks like it's successfully brought in charts and it is able to compile and launch. And this is the part where we actually create a graph. So let's see if I can remember how the heck to create a graph. So we have a create graph function here. The first thing we want to do is actually create a header view. And this should be an equal. And at the end of this, we're essentially going to say the table views table header view is the header view. We're going to want to say header view, clip it to bound so nothing overflows. I will also want to give it a width and a height. So I'm going to say view.frame.size.width, and same thing for the height as well, because we want it to be a square at the top of our table. All right, here comes the fun part for the chart. So we're going to go ahead and say our chart is going to be a bar chart view, and we can actually go ahead and create this with the frame which matches our header view. So we'll say 0, 0, and we can actually just paste this in here. Now we're going to want to go ahead and add this into our header view. So we'll say add subview for the chart. And our chart data, we want this to be chart data, but specifically, we're going to want it to be bar chart data. So let's go ahead and create this up here. This is going to be bar chart data, is what I'm looking for, like that. And bar chart data you can create with a collection of values. So you can use a data set, which is, you can have multiple collections of data sets, I should say, data set or data sets. So we'll go ahead and create this data set. So we'll go ahead and define this above it to keep it clean. All right, and this is going to be, I believe you can do a bar chart data set, and this gets created with the raw values itself. You can see it takes in a sequence of bar chart data set. Let's see what else. We have entries and labels. So I'm just going to go ahead and use this first one here for chart data entry. It's a collection of this. And essentially, we're going to take our day data and we're going to compact map it to our chart data entry. And it's going to be quite a few, so maybe we'll need to change this. But there's going to be X and Y. So let's figure out how we want to do this. So the X should just be incremented, so we move from left to right, and the Y should actually be the model dot count, which is going to be the number of cases. So let's see why this is yelling at me. This is an integer, and that is 0, so this should be sufficient. Let's see what the error here is. Cannot convert value of int to expected argument type of double. So what we could do is simply cast this as a double. And the other thing that I'm going to go ahead and do is, instead of doing this compact map, what we could actually do is create entries here. So I'm going to go ahead and create entries up here, which is going to be bar chart entry, or chart data entry, I should say, or we can just use this, it doesn't really matter. And we're going to say for index in 0 up until daydata.count, we can go ahead and get the data from our day data at the given index, and in our entries, we are going to append basically a x and a y, and the x is going to be the index, and the y is going to be the data.count, once again casted as a double. And I believe that's it. That's all we need to do. The other thing that we could do is specify colors for our data set. And there are some presets that you could use here. So I think there is a color style or something like that. There is a, let's see, colors actually takes in a array of, colors that we can pass in ourselves. However, there is presets that are available. I believe it's either themes or colors or something like that. So let's see if I can find what it's actually called. So there's set color. It's not what I'm looking for. Let's see if it's on the data itself. We'll go ahead and see if there is colors here. So we can go ahead and find what they are called. It's either theme or style or something of that nature. And if I can't find it, I'm not going to kill too much time on it here. I believe it is on the data set though. Let me just check the entries here. So we could look for, let's look for joyful, because I know that's one of the ones that it uses, and it'll be here. So here is a collection, and it's actually chart color template is what I'm looking for. And let's see where this is actually used. All right, chart color template. We could use these directly, but let's see. So we're going to say the datasets color is going to be chart color template. And let's see if it lets us do this. It does not, because this is count when we're trying to do colors. And that's actually not what it is either. And I'm, of course, not going to remember for the life of me where this gets assigned. Let's come into here. And I'm going to look for colors. So there is highlight color. But actually, before even I mess with colors a little too much, I can look at the docs for this. Let's go ahead and give it a run. Let's make sure it's actually working. So here we're appending the index, which we also want to cast as a double like that. I'm going to comment that out and give it a run. And we'll have a pretty big bar chart, I hope, at the top here. So let's see, there is our bar chart. Our cases started extremely high and they have gone pretty low, which is a really good sign. You can actually change up the axes here as well. It's hard to kind of make out what it is looking like because there's so many bars there. But let's go ahead and actually change the height of the header view here, because we could probably make this look a little nicer. So we'll say maybe divided by 1.5. And we'll do the same thing for the actual bar chart view as well. So let's come into here and we'll say the height here divided by 1.5 as well. Go ahead and give that a run. And let's see, I made a silly typo here. Let's see what's going on. So we have CG rect, and let's go ahead and line break this guy. And then let's see what's going on. We have width, and then we have height as well, which we want to divide by 1.5, which should not be an issue. So let's see why this is yelling at me. All right, value of CG size has no member width view, because I am making a silly typo. So divided by 1.5, we'll just go ahead and do that and give it a run. And okay, that's looking a lot nicer. Now this right axis, I don't like it. I prefer just the left and the top, but I do want to change the color here because it's kind of ugly without it. So we're going to come back to GitHub here, and I like leaving this stuff in the actual video so you guys can actually see how I go about, going through and finding stuff. So we're going to go to these demo projects, and there's quite a few, demos in here. So there's a bar chart view, there's a bubble chart view, candlestick. Let's look for colored line chart. And let's see if we have colors. So it looks like we do have colors here. Let's see where they're being used. All right, so we have the chart, we have a description, we can set pinch, legend, we can customize the axes. Where is our actual colors being used? So there's setup chart, there's set value font, and it looks like we're supplying the colors here for the particular data that we want to go ahead and use. That's not exactly what I'm looking for. So what I'm actually looking for is the template here. So let's come back here and let's see if I can look up where this guy is being used. So let's go ahead and read this. So this is saying that we can actually use this somewhere. And this basically returns a collection of these NS UI colors. So it should let us actually supply this to the colors here. So dataset.colors is actually a collection of colors that we can supply. So I'm going to go ahead and try to do this one more time. So this is an array of NSUI color. Oh, it does let us assign to it. Okay, I probably made a silly typo before. So that is actually what we wanted, but let's find a different type. I think joyful looks pretty nice, but let's go with, I don't know, it's a couple different ones in here. Let's try Liberty and see what that looks like. Otherwise, we're going to go with a different one. At this point, I'm being nitty gritty, but that's okay. That's the point of making our app look actually pretty nice. That one's not the nicest looking, so I'm going to try Joyful. And look at that. We have a pretty cool looking chart. Now, we have a ridiculous number of bars. So one thing that you might want to actually do is instead of using all of these all of the particular data counts here, what you could do is get a subset. So we could say our set is going to be our day data dot, we can get the suffix or prefix, we can get the most recent maybe 20 values, and we can go ahead and use that instead of using the entire array. So here we would just use the set instead of the entire day data. At this point, we would only have 20 values. Now we're actually plotting the values above it, but the bars are much smaller, which makes it look a whole lot more legible as well as just like nicer instead of having ridiculously tiny bars. Personally, I'd probably do 30 and then I'd probably hide the values. So let's see if there is a way to hide the values on here. I think there should be. So let's see, hides values is what I'm looking for. Or shows values, something like that. Let's see if I can find it in the next 30 seconds. So chart, I know you can configure a lot of the grid background and grid lines and all that stuff. There's a lot of things you can configure in this framework, which is why I'm kind of all over the place. But I mean, at this point, we're all over the place, so whatever. So looking for value colors, value fonts, there's value text color. So what we actually want to do is not show the values. So we can look for hide, and I can't seem to find it, so I'll probably just wrap it up here for the sake of everyone not getting a headache with me jumping around so much. But that's all I've got for you guys today. I mean, this is a pretty good bare bones COVID tracker app. Now what I would do is, first of all, let's go ahead and test this. Let's take a look at Alaska's cases. And let's see if things actually changed. So it looks like the topmost value here is 57,000 actually, which aligns with May 7th here. And here we have dataset as the label, which is not really what we want. We could change it. So a couple things that I would recommend here. I would get rid of the top axis, the right axis. I would maybe animate this chart. I believe there is an animation mechanism built into this framework. And what's also really nice in this framework is there is like different kinds of charts. So I really like personally the bar charts here, but this one's pretty cool too. This like line chart, but it's like filled in. So you can make this look really, really nice. You just have to spend time with it. And yeah, this is how filtering works. Now, we're way over time, so I do not want to spend more time and add a way to filter dates. But if you want to take it a step further and want to share it, maybe I can give you a shout out here on the channel. This API does give you the ability to get data based for a single day. So if you take a look at the URL endpoints here, it actually just has you pass in the date you care about. So maybe you can actually go ahead and make these rows tappable. And when you tap into it, you would get more information about that particular date. So that's all I've got for you guys today. Super long video. I've been doing shorter videos lately, and I've wanted to make an actual app and just make something longer on the channel. If you enjoyed the video, drop a like down below. If you watched till the very end, kudos to you. I was all over the place. Subscribe to the channel if you're into iOS, want to stick around. Thanks again for watching. I'll catch you on the next one.